Hello and welcome to the CEO Show. This is your host, Nick Vaidya, and our next guest is Ken Marlin, a former Marine Corps infantry commander rising from the enlisted ranks, and since then an entrepreneur, a tech CEO, senior corporate executive, and for the past 25 plus years an investment banker on the Wall Street. Institutional Investor has honored Ken multiple times, naming him in its Tech 50 list as a most disruptive figure in the financial technology sector, and later named him among the 50 most influential people as well. He's the managing partner of a boutique investment firm. Throughout his life, he has applied Marine Corps principles to leading successful businesses, and he has a book coming out soon called Battlefield to Boardroom. The conversation with Ken is long and winded. It has awesome examples, and we should recognize that sometimes it takes details to truly acquire a new mindset. To be a good negotiator, this conversation will certainly not fail you in that regard. If you want to develop the core muscles of the body of a negotiator, then you are at the right place at this moment. So let's hear what Ken has to tell us.
Ken, welcome to the CEO Show.
Nick, thank you very much for having me. What would you like to know?
Oh, I'd like to know a lot of different things, but let me give you a brief on where am I coming from. There are over 1,600 books on negotiations, and seemingly disjointed, disparate points of view, but they all come together primarily into this framework that goes back and forth between hardball negotiations versus building something collaborative, something that creates a vision, the Harvard negotiation project kind of thing. And, right now is a great time because, the new Prime Minister of England is known to be a very difficult woman, hardball negotiator. Our potential, I hope not, sorry, I shouldn't say these things, but potential President Donald Trump is known as a hardball negotiator. So I think it's a good thing to be looking at this topic right now. But particularly, we are right now working on an issue of the magazine focusing on negotiations. And so I'd like to get different points of views. And when I read about you, it was very interesting. And there's this concept of honor is very important to a lot of people, not everybody, but to a lot of people. And I think there is this in my mind, a lack of detailed insight into what you are seeing or what you've seen from your Marine Corps experience, from your vast investment banking entrepreneurship experience. And I'd like to understand, what did you observe that leads you to believe that the idea of coming from a higher moral ground, it's an advantage?
So I'm happy to go into that, and I do believe in what I call negotiating from the high ground, and I'll go into that in a little bit more depth as we talk, but the short answer on negotiating from the high ground is certainly that I'm not advocating being a wimp. Marines are not known for being wimps. I am not advocating that one should not understand the negotiating leverage that one may have in a situation and be willing to use that negotiating leverage as long as you do it in an honorable way, and we'll come back to that. I do believe that people need to recognize that just as peace follows war, the ultimate object in a negotiation is almost inevitably not the transaction itself. It's not whether or not you, at least in the sorts of negotiating we're talking about here. So we're not talking about here negotiating the purchase of a car, because that probably is in many respects the end of the transaction. If you're buying a washing machine, we're talking about negotiating from my perspective in a mergers and acquisitions context. And in the Marine Corps, you may be negotiating with someone that is leading a village or someone who's leading an organization that you are going to have a continuing relationship with. And it's important to remember that you're going to have that continuing relationship. I didn't say you're necessarily going to be the best of friends, But the relationship is not over on the day that a contract is signed or a peace treaty is signed. And that's the context in which I talk about negotiating in the book. Also, I haven't written a book on negotiating. There's a chapter in my book, one of 11 chapters, about negotiating, which is all in the context of running a business, whether it be a Wall Street business or a Main Street business, in what I call the Marine Corps way. And each chapter in the book is an element of that, and putting it all together, I believe, can help people to run I hesitate to use the word a better business, but I do believe that it can help you run a business more efficiently, more effectively for the long term, and also help people to be more effective. I have 8 rules of negotiating in my book, which I'm happy to go through, although I feel right now like I'm doing a bit of a monologue.
That's all right. That's what we are here for. I'll ask you questions when there is need for clarity.
Okay. But I'm not trying to be smarter than the people who wrote, for example, Getting to Yes. You mentioned the Harvard Negotiating Project. In fact, I went to that course at Harvard. I attended it. I'm actually quite a big believer in some of the things that they teach at the Harvard Negotiating Project. A big part of which I don't talk about much in the book. It's called Understanding Your Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement, or your BATNA, and I'm a big proponent of that. There are many books and articles that have written about negotiating. There's a famous scientific study on the power of something called anchoring in negotiating, which basically is what a rug merchant does when you come into the bazaar, and the rug merchant starts out and says, okay, you can have this rug and it's $5,000. Well, in the absence of all information, that anchored a number, and then you start negotiating from that number. That's a perfectly reasonable negotiating style. I'm really not trying to show people negotiating styles. I am trying to show them some rules of negotiating that help you win, and help you do so in an ethical manner that allows you to not only finish the negotiations with your head held high. It does help you to win, and it also helps you to have a lasting peace or a lasting relationship afterwards.
And so I completely get it. If I may summarize what you said, is that negotiation is not a program. It's not programmatic that you do this tactical steps. It is a framework where there are many, many elements, given situations, assumptions that are in operation, and different elements will play a different role in the situation. A single word such as negotiation has many connotations for a variety of situations and people. Like you just pointed out, there is the transactional negotiation, and then there is the negotiation that is about an agreement. Now, obviously, agreement is not the goal. Getting an agreement on the nuclear deal with Iran is not the goal. It's just a step, and that too, the first step. So if you think that the first step is the end, then you're mistaken. So I completely get that. And that's why people often tend to misapply, like, simple concepts as it's transaction versus agreement. If you're going to buy a car, your end game is, that's it, done. I mean, I'm never going to see that car agent, the new car salesman, maybe that's a new trainee, and you can ramrod your way, and you can skim and do all kinds of tactical maneuvers to get the best deal possible. And maybe that's what you should do. Ideally, in a marketplace. But in an agreement, nothing has happened until you follow through and deliver the results based on those agreements. So I understand, but oftentimes these things get people confused. No, I need to be difficult and hardballed because negotiation means I got to be tough. Well, that can actually hurt you sometimes, right?
Yeah, so tough is an interesting concept. I do believe, and my first rule of negotiating, in fact, is that you must be willing to walk from the table. And the other side must understand that there is a point at which you are willing to walk from the table. You could say that this is a variant on the Harvard Negotiating Project's concept of a BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. But what's important is that the other side understands that there is a point at which no agreement is better for you than a bad agreement. And it's not only important that you as a negotiator understand that you have a walkaway point. It's actually important that you communicate to the other side that there is this point, and there needs to be a logic to it. There are too many negotiations that we see in which one side proposes something gets done in 90 days and the other side wants 2 years, and there's no logic to either one. And they play around in between. I prefer one in which I say, if we're taking a time, we need until March of next year, and here's why we need until March of next year. We have an audit that gets completed. Audit's the calendar year. I can't get my auditor in until February. It's going to take that guy a full month, and I want another month of slop before I'm in violation. That's my logic. Now, if you have a different date in mind, I'm happy to have a conversation with you about what's your logic for that date, but there should be some basis for it, but I'm getting ahead of myself. But certainly my first rule of negotiating is that you have to be willing to walk from the table, and the other side needs to know that. Otherwise, you're not negotiating, you're just begging.
This is awesome, what you just said in the end, begging. I was going to say that you were fundamentally pointing out that are you collaborating to create value versus are you haggling? In other words, let me take more of what I can, which is perfectly legitimate goal to take the most you can, but you don't know where that other person is, what are their boundaries and limitations of the other person or other party. So is that why you say that the honor system is important, so that you can establish that level of trust where you say, you know, these are my boundaries. I cannot go beyond these boundaries.
I think that trust is an interesting concept. You mentioned the Iranians. I'm not sure anybody on our side of the table trusted the Iranians, nor do I believe that they trusted us. In a broad sense. But without some level of trust, there can never be an agreement, because there are no words on papers that can force people to do things. And there are times in which trust is misplaced. There are even agreements done, unfortunately, when people know that the other side will violate them. I think a classic example of that is Henry Kissinger's negotiation of the Paris Peace Accords to end the war in Vietnam. And the ultimate agreement between the parties was that both sides would withdraw their troops and allow democratic elections to take place. And the United States retained the right to return to Vietnam if that agreement were violated. I was in the Marine Corps at the time that those negotiations took place. I certainly wasn't part of them. I was a junior Marine Corps officer, but we certainly talked about it quite a lot. There was no doubt from any of my Marine friends, and I suspect there was no doubt in political circles, that the North Vietnamese was not going to remove its troops, and B, that we were never going to return. They came to an agreement which was a political expedient because Richard Nixon had promised the nation that he would get us out of Vietnam, and he was going to get us out of Vietnam no matter what.
It was just a face-saving device.
Absolutely. But in the normal sorts of negotiations, there is some level of trust that is always required, or there won't be an agreement. And that's a hard one sometimes for our clients to accept, that there is no way that you can have a contract that will protect you against all risk. It can't be done. We're in the mergers and acquisitions business. Buyers are always worried that sellers know something they don't. If the company is so great, why are they selling it in the first place? Is there a risk of competition? Is there a risk that technology will come and overwhelm the business? Is there a risk that key customers will leave you? Is there a risk that key managers will leave you? Is there a risk that key managers will get hit by a bus? There is no way to protect yourself by the written word against everything. Sellers have similar risks. Particularly if the seller is going to remain with the company and hopes that the company will help them build a bigger business going forward. Will the buyer live up to their promises? If there are promises of future payments, will they be made? Will somebody come up with an excuse not to make them? Can I trust these guys? Without trust, without some level of trust, there can be no agreement.
Now the collaboration aspect that is being promoted, which makes perfect sense, identify a goal that is common and work as partners. But oftentimes, like you just said, there is a conflict of interest, and it is just not possible for you to see collaboration as the only and true goal. It is likely that people maintaining their word is going to work. Otherwise, there is no incentive for one of the parties to continue to follow through with the agreement.
I think that's absolutely correct. You use the word collaboration, and some negotiations are in fact trying to reach a collaborative agreement, but not all. There are many negotiations in which there is a buyer, a seller, and a transaction that's going to take place. Classically, when you have a corporation that's divesting a subsidiary, for example, when you have a private equity firm that's on the buy side or the sell side, similarly in many negotiations, I'll digress just for a moment here. I have not been a banker for 30 years. I've been a banker for about 20 years, but for actually more than 10 years before that, I ran several technology companies, and I had to negotiate selling services to large corporations who would buy them. And of course, even now, and other times you negotiate leases, you negotiate with customers, you negotiate with vendors. They're not always collaborative relationships, but you would not be sitting down to the table and having a negotiation at all if both sides didn't see the possibility for some sort of an agreement that would allow both parties to walk away with what they wanted. And my second rule of negotiating is that you have to understand what it is you want. You have to clearly have your eye on the prize, and sometimes not let yourself get diverted by small nuisances in the negotiation that you may be able to live with or come up with some compromise in order to get you to that ultimate prize. Too often we see negotiations get hung up when amateurs spend much too much time negotiating things that are of relatively small consequence when compared with the larger prize.
I have to interrupt you. I know exactly what you just said, and this is a very common experience when people negotiate, because the human mind is such, it's a flawed instrument, as I call it. And managing the human mind your own, more importantly, is critical. And when certain stimuli is received, oftentimes the mind is trained to react in a certain way. So for example, if someone is being dishonorable, we are likely to react in a highly negative way, when you could actually possibly see that that is really not important, get this thing done and move on. Just an example. But when, like you said, people who are not experienced, trained, or skilled in the art of negotiation, then they will make those kind of mistakes. And almost everybody does, because there's a point at which every human mind starts misfunctioning in any given situation.
So you're absolutely correct. There are times in which these responses are emotional, which is one reason why we frequently advise clients to not negotiate directly with the principals negotiate directly until and unless we get to some point in which the intermediaries are stymied, in which case you may want to bring the principals into the room, because there is a certain amount of danger of emotional responses. Sometimes, though, perhaps this is a variant on emotion, I can think of a couple of examples. We had a client, a European financial services company, a fairly large company, looking at acquiring a mid-sized technology company a few years ago. And their focus, the large company's focus, their question was, will these guys fit with us? We know their technology works, and we're within a reason probably willing to pay the price that they're looking for. But this company didn't do a lot of acquisitions. They wanted to know that everything was going to fit. And for them, one of the key areas was that the small company installed software on the customer's premises. The large company preferred a centralized server solution. It's a version of what we would now call SaaS, software as a service. And they wanted to know that the people in the smaller company would work with them over time to migrate their company to a SaaS solution. Meanwhile, the CEO of the company that was being sold, who was very excited about the prospect of joining the large company, and would make a lot of money out of the deal and was very interested in it, all he wanted to talk about was where would his office be, how much freedom would he have, what new offices would he be able to open around the world, would he be able to fly on the corporate jet, a whole bunch of things which my client really didn't even want to talk about right now. From my client's perspective, these are all nuisance things we'll talk about later once we figure out if we want to do this deal. And this guy, the smaller company, was not our client, and he had an advisor who should have just told him to stay away and we'll handle this part. He just got to a point where my client just walked away. My client just said, I can't buy this company. And it wasn't about price. And I don't think to this day he understands that. But it had nothing to do with price. So I think it's important that it's my second rule. You have to know where you're going, stay focused on that. And one of my other rules is negotiate the big things before you negotiate the small things.
This is very instructive as an example, both about clarity of what you want, because it's not what you want, it's what the other party wants. And if you cannot provide to the other party what they want, then they're not interested in you at all. So unless you can establish, if you are at both sides need to do that. But if one of the parties is doing that, that's exactly what is wrong. But let me get back to this idea of honor, which is really what I wanted to, the higher ground, as you said. I want to understand really why is it that you're saying. So, we talked about conflict of interest in negotiations. There's a collaboration part, we're clear on that. But collaboration will only happen when you have trust and clarity. Whereas in many instances, you cannot have the level of clarity that you desire. You just have to live with what you're finding, what you're getting. and you have to, the rest has to be set on faith or trust. And the conflict of interest is really the reason why you're lacking trust, but also the fact that I just don't know. It's not a conflict of interest. At the moment, I just don't know. So trust and conflict of interest do go together. Is that why? Because looking at your background, the kind of deals that you negotiate, when you say moral high ground, is that why you're talking about? Because the most trustworthy people would be the ones who follow a code of conduct and not what feels right.
I think that that's correct. I think that I can touch on your conflict of interest statement, but your code of conduct is actually the one that's more on point here. People should be clear about what their interests are. And so the only time that I see what people refer to as a conflict of interest is when those theoretical conflicts have not been disclosed to people. So we see this periodically with lawsuits. There was one not long ago in which a Delaware court ruled that a fairly prominent investment bank was guilty of a conflict of interest when it advised a company to accept a bid for the company without disclosing its role in financing the buyer in the transaction and without disclosing its relationship with the buyer, and its continued and ongoing relationship with the buyer. Okay, you might call that a conflict of interest. I would call that unethical. I would say that, but the unethical part was not so much that they had a relationship with the buyer and the seller, it's that they didn't tell them about it. It's that they didn't talk about it. We've had quite a number of transactions in which we were basically asked to be the honest broker in making a transaction happen where we had a strong relationship with both buyer and the seller. But we were honest about it, open about it. People understood where we stood, where our motivations were, and where were the bounds of our authority. So coming back to your comment about a code of conduct, I think that that's much more where I'm heading when we talk about negotiating from the high ground. So that code of conduct, though, is not only about morality. I'm not trying to be some sort of moral compass for people, other than I do believe in a Marine Corps coda, which is about doing the right things for the right reasons every time. So one of my, we talked about a few rules, things about being willing to walk away from the table and knowing where you're going. Those are not moral imperatives. Those are important to negotiating. But another one of my negotiating rules is simple. It's called tell the truth, right? Don't lie. We see people lie in negotiations. Now, if I had some of the people here in the room that I'm thinking about and I told them the story about why I think that they were lying, they would tell me they weren't lying. I would tell them they were. Because to me, a lie is when you know something to be the truth and you assert something different, either overtly or by omission, but knowing that your omission will allow someone to draw a conclusion which you know to be false. We had another client one time. It was the German stock exchange, Deutsche Börse. They were looking at acquiring a company that they were quite pleased with. The company gave them some forecasts, and companies don't give people forecasts, people give people forecasts, right? So, the owners of the company, the two founders and leading members of the company, gave Deutsche Börse a financial forecast. And based on that financial forecast, there were some price negotiations, and a basic agreement was reached on price. As time went on, it became obvious to us and to Deutsche Börse that the company wasn't going to achieve its financial forecast for the year, or certainly it looked that way to us. When we began to question, the more we questioned the numbers and looked into it, the more they dug in their heels and insisted that they would make the numbers, absolutely. And the more we didn't believe them. And at some point, our client said to them, okay, fine. You're highly confident in that. You insist you will, right? How about we reduce the upfront portion of the purchase price by about a third, and you can not only make that third back in 6 months, which is when the end of the year was, we'll actually give you an opportunity to exceed that price. Well, they totally backed off and didn't want to do that. And it just became clearer and clearer that they were not telling the truth about where the company was headed. Our client walked away from that transaction not because in the previous example people were negotiating the wrong things, and not because of price, but because they lost trust. They lost faith in the two key members of the firm they were buying, and said, if I don't trust them on this, how can I trust them on anything? So one of our rules is don't lie. It's tell the truth. It's more than don't lie, because I think there are some negotiators who say, well, I cannot lie by simply not telling the truth. My rule is tell the truth.
This is extraordinarily important in my point of view. And shortcuts people do take, and oftentimes people win because of shortcuts. But then we only hear of the wins, we don't hear of the losses. My favorite example in this situation is of someone like Madoff, or someone like any of these unethical people, or my Dick Fold of Lehman Brothers. When you are successful and you see success, you presume that whatever you did caused the success. What you do not realize is it could be the biggest mistakes you're making. And if you fail the way Madoff failed or Dick Fold failed, then you truly have not been successful in life. Following fundamental good principles, in general, for most people, in the long run, always work. This is very simple, very elegant. But
very interesting. I will digress from negotiating for a minute. There's I think I do actually mention this in my book. I have a theory as to the object of life. Now, to be clear, the object of life is not the same as the meaning of life. I have not yet figured out the meaning of life, right? But I do have a theory as to the object of life, which I haven't yet copyrighted, but I did invent, and therefore, if you repeat it, I think you have to say, as Ken Marlin says.
I will keep that in mind.
So I believe that life has four important dimensions. There are, by the way, some other dimensions I will acknowledge, but it has four dimensions that are important to me. The first three are fairly straightforward. They are length, breadth, and depth. Length is not exactly the amount of time that you are on the planet, but it does, the amount of time that you're on the planet, it does have an impact. But it is also, you get length from the amount of time that you spend in any particular endeavor, whether that endeavor is downhill skiing or being an investment banker or being a journalist. You are in it for some length of time. And to some extent, more length, I should say, where I'm going to get to, just to telegraph part of this, is about maximizing volume. And length is a dimension of volume. Depth, however, is an equally important measure of volume, and depth gets into how deeply you are into any particular subject. So Mozart, who died when he was around 35, I believe, didn't have a lot of length, but had tremendous depth in his music. Mozart also had something I call breadth. Breadth has to do with the different experiences you are. So look at Stephen Jobs, who not only had depth in personal computers, but depth in music, depth in movies, depth in many things, each one of which adds volume, and greater depth is no more and no less important than greater length. And breadth, is when you see the multi-dimensional people. There are some people
multi-talented.
Yeah, they're amazing when you see these people who
Benjamin Franklin, I think they're called math pod. I don't know what you call them, math pod, or there's a word, who are great at multiple topics.
There are, but I worked with a woman one time in investment banking who was quite a talented woman, and someplace along the way I realized that she was originally trained as a classic violinist, but then went off and started doing rock violin and spent years traveling the world with some of the greatest rock bands in the world as a rock violinist. It was a whole other dimension to the woman that had nothing to do with her being in the investment banking world. So we have length, we have depth, we have breadth, which are the classic three dimensions of volume, but there is a fourth dimension which was triggered by something you just said, and it's called honor. Because if you are Bernie Madoff and you have great length and you have great depth in your ability to swindle people, right? And you may have great breadth in all of the different experiences you all have, but it all has to get multiplied by your honor. And if you have no honor, you have no volume. And the flip side of that, and I don't know how to measure it, but Mahatma Gandhi had tremendous honor, which is just a multiplier on his length and breadth and depth. And so I'll come back to the object of life, not necessarily the meaning of life, at least for me, is to maximize volume.
This is beautiful. I'm so glad that I'm talking with you. First of all, congratulations on the way you have framed it. I think it's beautiful. I think it's amazing because I talk with a lot of people and I gather a lot of information from them, a lot of insights from them. I enrich myself in doing so. And, the breadth concept, all of these independently I've talked about, put together, no. And this is not part of our recording. This is all not, it'll be edited out. But one thing I look at the purpose of life. Well, let me backtrack. I don't know why we are doing this, but this is good. We are almost like a cell of a large body. And we don't see the body. We don't know. That is the global consciousness. And we believe we are independent. We really are not. Look at ants. A single ant has no intelligence, but the collective can create beautiful architecture. And so we have a purpose. And the purpose is not the individual, but the purpose is this species or something bigger than that. Wherever the universe is trying to, whichever direction it's moving, the momentum is going to tell you what to do. And as long as you support the universe, you're doing the right things. An effective way of living is not just EQ, IQ, but I call something called NQ and SQ. And EQ, IQ, I understand, I can imagine that. NQ is what I call nature quotient. Do you really understand the laws of nature, laws of human existence? Like character, loyalty. I think these are incredibly efficient traits. They're not just about morality. Loyalty is a way to create something like Marine Corps, which is extraordinary. Or anything else you might want to think of, where the group, the individual, all are able to give something that otherwise is simply impossible. So why is Marine Corps able to do that, or some other institutions are able to do that? Because this another concept, which is not individual, it is part of the collective. And that's why when I look at the ideas of honor and character, they individually may not work. In a country where everybody is corrupt, you being honorable and of strong character may really not lead you to any, materialistic success or even relationship success, because everybody is dishonorable. It's almost like in Syria, people are fighting for themselves and everybody's looking after themselves. But when you bring together a system, a group of people, where they collectively buy into that concept, the system produces extraordinary results. You cannot take the American way of living and then superimpose on Iraq, or the other way around. What's important is the system and the people need to come together, and when we are able to create such systems, it creates value, tremendous amount of value. That's why the honor is that multiplier.
I totally agree with you. I work in a world right now in the Wall Street investment bank world, which is not a world in which I grew up. I did not graduate school and then become an analyst at a big bank and work my way up through associate and vice president and principal and the like. I left college after my sophomore year, and without telling my parents, enlisted in the Marine Corps and then spent 10 years in the Marine Corps, and during which the Marine Corps graciously allowed me to complete my bachelor's degree and to get my MBA, and then I owed them another 3 years. And then I spent 10 years leading Main Street companies before I went into investment banking. And I find myself in a world in which I actually do believe that investment bankers can add value for their clients. I believe that we think of ourselves as a strategic advisor as well as a financial advisor. I believe that we can serve an extremely useful purpose, but I find myself consistently reading stories or seeing stories in the media about investment bankers. And by the way, this is not only investment bankers. I also see it about CEOs of companies, and I see it about politicians who take advantage of the unwary, who take advantage of the unsophisticated, who take advantage of gray areas, who believe that anything that is not explicitly illegal is fine, and it's fine even if it is explicitly illegal if you think that the odds of getting caught are low or the penalties for getting caught are low. And they think that the object of life is to do the best for themselves that they can do. And if it's a politician, it's about getting reelected and getting more money in your coffers. And you mentioned Dick Fuld and others. Actually, in the specific case of Dick Fuld, I actually think Dick Fuld honestly drank his own Kool-Aid. I think he really did believe that what they were doing was fine, unlike Bernie Madoff. But you see these people for whom the object of life is more toys, and I believe that I have run pretty successful Main Street businesses. I believe that I am running a pretty successful Wall Street investment bank without succumbing to this philosophy that it's okay to take advantage of the unwary. And I'm not trying to do this moralistically, or at least I'm not saying that people have to sacrifice money. I have no problem with people who make money. I have no problem with making money for myself and for my partners here in the firm. I have no problem with toys. As long as we achieve our successes in a way that I'm proud of, as long as we achieve our successes in ways we're not afraid to see splashed on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, as long as we achieve our successes in ways that will continue to make my parents proud of me. And I believe it can be done. And I believe people can make money. And in fact, I believe that we can do so in a way that not only makes us proud of ourselves, it also avoids billions of dollars of fines.
And one of the key things I feel is that it's a simple matter of honoring your word. It's a simple matter of honoring your commitments and agreements, because without that, the whole system will come to a halt. I come originally from a country where corruption was and is rampant. I've seen two different systems, and I recognize the value of a good system. And when you undermine a system, you do terrible things because it's seriously bad juju, bad karma. And it's not just about you, but when you change your approach to the world in a different way, instead of being solipsistic, individualistic, hedonistic, self-serving individual, if you could be part of the collective, the peace and I won't say prosperity. It's not about financial. It's not because that is counterproductive. It's not about you. It's not all about you. You are here, and you are here in collaboration with a lot of people, and you're taking a lot of things from people, and you made an agreement to give back certain things, and you just follow through that principle, because otherwise your progeny will be left with a worse situation. But even if it is not about anything else, the idea of living with peace because you are being not moralistic, righteous, but you're following a set of principles, not convenience, but conviction, it is more empowering.
It is, and I agree with you. But I must say that, I wrote a book about 11 key principles to helping people win, and whether they can win, whether on Wall Street, where they can win on Main Street, they could win if they're in Washington, D.C. And it's not a book that says that people need to take a vow of poverty. I actually do believe that if you subscribe to the 11 principles and you use them, you can have a more effective business. You can have a more effective firm, and a byproduct of that, if you are in a for-profit operation, ought to be more money. And I have no problem with that. And I don't believe anybody will adopt these principles unless they believe it will make their organization more effective. But I do believe that as a side benefit of this, you get to feel good about yourself.
You're stronger as a human being. You're stronger as a human being when you know that you're doing. First of all, you need to make sure that the principles you're following are genuine and real. I mean, the universe does say that's the universe's nature. I mean, when you say loyalty is not going to work in Sierra Leone or in Uganda during the time of Idi Amin. Those principles will be violated, okay? But loyalty will work within a subgroup that adheres to that code of conduct, and that helps you do bigger things. So I'm not saying being stupid. I'm not saying, you go to a country where there's rampant corruption and try to start a business without bribing somebody. Actually, I'm being honest about it. Best thing is not to go there. But if you must go there, then you have to follow the norms and the mores of that group. There's no other way. So choose not to go there. But if you are going there, then you've got to get the results you want for the greater good. But the new set of principles will emerge in that system. But in this system, you see what the principles are and follow them because they make sense, and that empowers you. That's what I believe is important. Nobody's saying that don't make money, or my favorite example is of the lion or the tigers. When they go hunting, they have something called the eye of the tiger when the ears tune in and they identify the prey. And even if another deer comes across, they don't deviate. They go for that prey that maybe further. Sometimes they lose. But if you look at statistically, that's the best strategy. And same thing goes for loyalty and other concepts of honor and character. It is not about morals and religious high ground or anything of that sort. It's just, those are good principles. Those are the principles the universe has laid down. And if we follow them, we tend to succeed. And I'm as delighted as I am to take so much time of yours. I want to come back and conclude this idea that when you said about the moral high ground, you're talking about when you're making deals that are inherently risky, unclear, and you're making a lot of judgment calls. You are dealing with a lot of unknown issues, and you simply have to make a decision. At that point, dealing with a person, team, people, with a code of conduct that is clear enough to you as trustworthy, you are more likely to succeed.
I think that you are more likely to succeed as a business in the long term, but you may not come to agreement on this particular deal. And it is something to bear in mind. You don't necessarily have to win every single battle to win the war. Not only that, you don't have to even engage in every single battle to win the war.
I think this is the most important statement of all of this. This is the conclusion of it all. That, because otherwise people will say, well, yeah, but, I could win that battle by being slightly disingenuous, so to speak, at this point. And it makes sense, but then you want to give up. Because in the long run, if you keep doing this, then you're going to hurt. That's what you're saying, that you don't have to fight all battles.
I think that's correct. And I think we're running out of time, but there are many stories that I could tell. Early in the history of this company, when we had been in business for about a year and were not making any money, we were invited to advise a fairly prestigious company on a potential acquisition. And the truth is, we were brought in because a friend of mine was the CEO of the company and he was trying to help. And we needed the money. And we helped them look at an acquisition, and after examining it and talking to the people, and I'm making a long story short, I came to the conclusion that the large company should not buy this company. And I went to the CEO, who was also a friend, and I told him that. Now, we lost a big fee as a result of that. Having said that, a year later, they came back to us with another transaction, and 2 years later, they came back to us with another, and we're now talking to them about another. In the short term, I think there are a lot of people who would say that I was foolish. They identified the candidate. They said they wanted to buy them. I should have just helped them buy them. Instead, I went to them and said, don't buy them. Short term, did we lose? Maybe. Long term, I think we won.
This is a great lesson, but it's not something you can teach anybody until they are ready. But we can only follow by example. And I think in terms of this conversation and the magazine, I'd really like to write about why this really makes sense from a logical perspective, because it's not from the moral high ground alone, but it is simply more effective. And I differentiate from the word successful, just like Stephen Covey does. So Ken, thank you so much. I absolutely enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.